Evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for part 2 of our 2-part webinar, Israel and Anti-Semitism for Curious Non-Jews. For those of you who weren't with us last night, during Operation Guardian of the Walls, the war that lasted for 11 days in May, Hamas was rather successful in making it look like the war they had planned with Iran's help was just righteous rioting because of a real estate dispute. As a result, anti-Semitism dramatically increased worldwide and 250% in the UK specifically. This led to my college friend, Lara Klett, reaching out to me and asking if I wanted to do a webinar on anti-Semitism for non-Jews. And then she ended up doing at least 90% of the work for this webinar. Laura is a devout Christian who graduated from the University of Maryland in 2020 with a bachelor's and master's in finance and currently works for Freddie Mac, not a Jewish or pro-Israel organization. She is simply a modern-day righteous Gentile who saw a need for the Christian community especially, but truly all non-Jews, to be aware of anti-Semitism and the role they can play in stopping it. People like Laura give me much hope for the future. I will now turn it over to her to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Naomi. I really appreciate that wonderful introduction. So our three main goals of this event is to speak on the Jewish history of Israel, just so people overall can have an overview of what it is, engage in multi-faith perspectives of people's support for Israel, and discuss how to combat anti-Semitism and where it arises from. Naomi, she is co-host of this webinar series and is Director of Communications at Endowment for Middle East Truth. She is also, as she mentioned, we're really great friends from college, and she is also an experienced editor at from the Diamondback UMD's independent student newspaper, and she wrote at the Jerusalem Post and the Cleveland Jewish newspaper in 2018 and 2017. She double majored in government and politics and Spanish at the University of Maryland, College Park. And so she's done great things, and I know she's doing great things right now. So our first speaker today is Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour, and apologies if I might have butchered your name. He is director of Emet's program for emerging democratic voices from the Middle East at Endowment for Middle East Truth. Hussein participated in the Arab Spring, received political asylum in the United States in 2012, and in addition to Emet, he also works as an educator and public speaker at Stand With Us. So Hussein, without further ado, you are welcome to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Laura and Naomi, for putting this together, and thank you everybody who tuned in today to be with us tonight. Basically, the history of terrorist attacks on Israel, or the struggle between Israel and terrorism, really goes back, if we want to have a larger historical perspective, since before the establishment of the state. There was a lot of resistance from the Arab population towards any idea of Jewish return to the Jewish homeland, let alone the establishment of a Jewish state. Now, this is a little bit of a contentious historical issue because the Palestinians or pro-Palestinians or people who like to adopt a Palestinian narrative, they will point at that violence back then and describe it as the beginning of Palestinian resistance, which is historically inaccurate for many reasons. One of its most prominent reasons is actually that Palestinians as an Arab national identity, as understood today, did not exist at the beginning of the 20th century. It actually didn't emerge, the beginning truly of what we may describe as a roots of Palestinian nationalism or idea of a national identity at the best and earliest dates to later after World War I. But before that, the contention and the attacks on early Jewish settlements in Israel were largely motivated by either xenophobic or anti-Semitic, or just disputes over land, or just a fear of the fear of economic competition that European modes of production and paradigms of property ownerships were bringing. So it was also a problem of modernization. Now, this escalated quickly as nationalistic fervor started to spread all over the Middle East. That was a period when nationalism started to actually make an influence from Europe on a lot of Middle Eastern nations, and then an ideology of Arab nationalism started to appear. And Arab nationalism, since its beginning, really in the beginning of the 20th century, and especially in the 20s, was directly tied or modeled after German nationalism. Now, we know that German nationalism, that period, was not a benign nationalism. It was very racial, supremacist, and it was very anti-Semitic. And a lot of those paradigms that are tied into the German national philosophy, unfortunately, were passed as well by the intellectuals the Arab intellectuals who copied that structure and formed Arab national ideology or nationalistic ideology based on that paradigm. So, beginning specifically from the World War I period, and especially in the 1920s, we started seeing a true spike in anti-Semitism against Jews, but not even Jews that were settling at the time in what is today Israel, but also Jews that were in Iraq, Jews that were in Egypt. Anti-Semitism started to rise quite significantly. This also was aided by a lot of literature that was translated from Europe. Primarily here, we're talking about the Protocols of Zion. Now, the Protocols of Zion, if you don't know, it's an anti-Semitic book that was written in Russia about the year 1900. And it basically supposedly describes a Jewish plan for world domination. That book was translated into Arabic and it started to disseminate. Now, this rise of anti-Semitic fervor and nationalistic sentiments, coupled with the arrival of waves of Jewish immigration to present-day Israel, started to create violent frictions between Arabs and Jews in the region. Then there are many prominent events. There were the massacre in Hebron in the 1920s. There was what is called the Arab Revolt in the 1930s. A lot of Jews, it was basically pogroms. A lot of Jews were killed at the time. Now, especially towards the 1930s, with the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism in Europe, unfortunately, a lot of Arab leaders were inspired by the rise of Hitler. Now, maybe the most prominent name here would be Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Hajj Amin al-Husseini is from al-Husseini family. He's one of the most prominent families of Jerusalem. And he was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. So he was basically the biggest Islamic authority. And he was very fond of Nazism. Not just that, after the break of World War II, he wrote a lot of appeals to the Nazi he said, after you solve the Jewish question in Europe, basically talking about the annihilation of European Jews, you should come solve the Jewish question here in the Middle East. And of course, the implication and the meaning of that is not missed on anybody. But not just the promotion of Nazism in the Middle East. We saw from Husseini, he actually traveled to Germany in the early 1940s. He met with Adolf Hitler. He has pictures with Adolf Hitler. It was actually revealed recently, I think only a few months ago, that he actually toured concentration camps. So he exactly knew what was going on. And he was accompanied by many Arab national leaders, and they built a strong relationship between the Third Reich and the Arab nationalist movements. And they even helped the Third Reich to recruit European Muslims to the ranks of Nazi forces. For this, Hajj al-Husseini was rewarded by a mosque in Berlin, a membership of the Berlin Islamic Institute, and also a radio station that in Arabic that was called the Voice of Berlin, from which he managed the station and from which he could broadcast Nazi propaganda to people in Egypt, to the British Mandate Palestine at the time, and to Iraq. And unfortunately, that was so effective in even aggravating the anti-Semitism even further. And that led to several pogroms, as I said, in Iraq. In Cairo, there were bombings in the Jewish quarter, in which many Jews were killed. In Morocco, in Libya, there were pogroms started to break out all over the region. This was well before the establishment of the State of Israel. Following the end of World War II, and thankfully the victory of the Allies, Great Britain at the time, they had the British Mandate, and then we had the establishment, Britain leaving, and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. This was received by the Arab countries as unacceptable. They did not accept the reality of a Jewish state in the region and immediately invaded Israel. Since that beginning of the Jewish state, Israel has been dealing with the issue of terrorism. I'm not going to talk about the conflicts that Israel had with other states. We're going to talk specifically about terrorism. We know that following 1948, after the Israeli victory and the establishment of the State of Israel, specifically Egypt trained groups that they were called back then the Fidaiyin or the Fidaiyun, and they were basically militant guerrillas whose job was to infiltrate the Israeli border and attack the first town in sight. We're not talking about military operations here. We're talking about military operations that targeted civilians. We're not talking about wars. We're not talking about interstate conflicts. We're talking about direct assault on communities that primarily lived in the Negev area. That really sparked the next round of conflict then between Egypt and Israel. And for quite a period of time, the Palestinians truly were absent from the scene. This is primarily because Palestinian national identity itself had not truly existed, and the fact that other Arab nations were basically taking the charge or the lead in a confrontation with Israel. Terrorism, or Palestinian terrorism against Israel, started to really take shape following the Six-Day War in 1967. Because after 1967, of course, a large number of the Arab population came under Israeli sovereignty or Israeli control, and also the defeat of the Arab armies was so decisive that basically that sparked the end of interstate conflict between Arab states and Israel. And from 1967, at that time, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was formed, and they started to, from Jordan, they were based in Jordan, and they started to cross the border to the West Bank to do different terrorist attacks against Israel. Now, these kind of attacks included bus kidnappings. So they would kidnap, let's say a school bus. There was something called the Avivim school bus. Many children, unfortunately, were murdered in this terrorist attack, civilian buses. But back then, terrorism was different. So it was basically a few guerrilla fighters will have AK-47s, a couple of grenades. They will infiltrate the borders at night, and then at day, and they will see the first bus passing, and then they will go attack the bus and kill everybody there. That was a form of terrorism that really started after 1967, and that was truly the beginning of terrorism in the way that we even know it today. Then there was, of course, the Munich terrorist attack that was also was conducted by a cooperation between the Palestinian Front of Popular Liberation and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in which the Israeli delegation at the Munich Olympics in 1971 was attacked and most of its members murdered brutally in a very unfortunate and very sad event. After that, 1970s were the decade of plane abductions. I don't know if you guys know about this, but there was an era, and you can watch even American Hollywood movies from the time. You'll find a lot of movies that have that theme, because that was the era when abducting a plane really started. The most famous incident probably is the Entebbe plane, when Palestinian terrorists kidnapped a Palestinian plane and landed it in Uganda, in the Entebbe airport. And then there was an Israeli rescue mission that was very famous. I think there's a movie about it. But the 1970s were quite well known with this paradigm of terrorist attacks. Suicide bombers did not come yet. All of this is going to come later. It was primarily abducting airplane and trying to murder the Israeli diplomatic missions in different areas of the world. The Israeli ambassador to the UK was murdered, I think, in the late 70s. This continued for quite some time till the 1980s. The 1980s is really that saw a shift in the terrorist or the paradigm of terrorist attacks against Israel. And this shift had to do with a larger cultural shift that was happening in the Middle East that started in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The Islamic Revolution of Iran caused a whole pivot in the Middle East from secular or the projects of secular nationalism into Islamic and religious identification. And this started a wave of re-Islamization for the Middle East, the rising of religiosity. If you guys are young, let me shock you and tell you that before the end of the 70s, the Middle East was not like it is today. Our ideas of terrorism, jihadism, those things, they are not eternal. They are actually quite recent. Before the Iranian Revolution, those things were not really, they were obscure concepts at best, and they were not the big phenomena that we know them today. Here, the first Islamic group to really start committing terrorism against Israel was actually a Shia group, Hezbollah, who actually came to be established during the Lebanese Civil War at the beginning of the 80s. And they were the first one to conduct serious terrorist attacks against Israel. They were later followed by another group that was established in the late 80s, but this time in the Palestinian territories themselves, it is a group that's known with Hamas. If you've been following the news, I'm sure you have heard the name of Hamas. Hamas was established at the end of the 80s as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a larger Islamic ideological movement. They were very active during the first Intifada, beginning in 1989, throughout the beginning of the 90s. And this is the first time that Israelis saw the kind of extremely brutal terrorism of suicide bombings. So somebody takes a suicide belt, goes into a restaurant and blows themselves up. This was well before 9/11. The first people that faced this kind of terrorism that the United States later faced and caused a whole, a change of the world order pretty much, actually started against Israelis. During all of those different periods of terrorism, anti-Semitism was at the core of whatever those terrorists preached, said, or wanted. We can see this from the propaganda that they make. They reproduce Nazi propaganda. They dehumanize Jews completely. And this is how they justified the killing of Israeli Jewish children, whether in school buses or suicide bombings and in pizza restaurants. There was always a justification that even if it was a child, it was a Jewish child, so they deserved to die, which is extremely dehumanizing. Unfortunately, the Islamic movement of Hamas continued to rise in power. Other Islamic movements started to come into being as well. The second most prominent Islamic terrorist group that is active in the Palestinian territories today in the Gaza Strip is called the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad has a long history, but it was basically sparked by Iran. It was an Iranian initiated movement. Now, Hamas has ties with Iran, but Hamas started independently and then received Iranian patronage. And since then, Hamas has been gaining power in the Gaza Strip, eventually assuming power completely in 2005, kicking out the Palestinian Authority, and now becoming a terrorist organization that is ruling over about 2 million Palestinians. And they use Gaza as a launch pad of terrorist attacks against Israel in the primary form of Qassam rockets, homemade rockets that they fired indiscriminately on Israelis. They also have other things. They try to infiltrate the borders, they dig tunnels, they go under, they try to come up on the Israeli side and kill Israelis and kidnap Israelis into the Gaza Strip to hold them as a negotiation or a bargain card. They also use something called incendiary kites. Now, basically what they do is they get some sort of, they use very simple ideas in order to do this diabolical terrorist attack. So they get kites and they fill it with, let's say, gasoline, and then they set it on fire, and then they fly to the other side in the hope that it will fall on some sort of a field or a wooden structure, and then the entire place will catch on fire, which actually happened many times to the agrarian agricultural community, Israeli communities that are around the Gaza Strip. So this has been the situation with Hamas. They control the Gaza Strip. They have a hold over 2 million Palestinians, which they use pretty much as a human shield against Israelis, while they are indiscriminately firing at Israelis. Following them coming to power, Hamas, by the way, is considered a terrorist organization, not just by Israel, but also by the United States, by many other Arab countries in the region, that they generally oppose the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. There's been a blockade on Gaza, both from Israel and Egypt, not just from Israel, because Egypt shares the same Israeli concerns when it comes to Hamas, an Islamic movement, being in power. That blockade basically prohibits any movement in or outside from the West Bank, from Gaza, except for whether humanitarian aid, basic supplies of food, medication, and so on, or emergency cases. And that's been the case since 2006. And the latest round of violence that we have seen was another round of many other repeated rounds when Hamas, the terrorist organization of Hamas from the Gaza Strip, indiscriminately fires thousands of rockets on Israelis, to which Israel will have to respond or has had to respond with some surgical strikes aimed at the terrorist infrastructure of Hamas. This is what we have seen been going on for a very long time. Now, the last point I will touch on, I see Nathan finally graced us with his presence. The last thing that I'll touch on is the issue of Iran. Now, since 1979, the Iranian Islamic Republic that was established after an Islamic revolution that happened there, there was a secularist monarchy. It was very autocratic. It was not a democratic monarchy. It was not a good monarchy. But then it was overthrown by a popular Islamic revolution that brought to power a truly theocratic Islamic state. In that theocratic Islamic state, there is something called the Ayatollah. The Ayatollah is basically the biggest and the highest Islamic authority in the country. And he's basically in charge of the country, and he's the one who determines the policy for the country. And this resulted into Iran being an extremely oppressive state. There are a lot of concerns about women's rights in Iran. There's a lot of concerns about minority rights in Iran. There's a lot of concerns about LGBTQ. They actually execute gay people in Iran. That's a penal code that they have. If you're caught and you're gay, you actually get executed. That's just a punishment of being a homosexual in Iran. And since the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran, they've sworn that they will work towards the complete destruction of the state of Israel. And they do that out of extremely and profoundly anti-Semitic vision, hatred towards Jews, hatred towards Israel. And it's not a secret. Like, this is not Hussein interpreting what Iran wants. That's actually what Iran says that they want. You ask them, what do you guys want? We want to annihilate Israel. They have actually a public clock, a countdown clock that keeps counting till the day that it will come and destroy Israel. Since they came to power, they started sponsoring many terrorist groups around the region that aimed at attacking Israel, but they're also Arab enemies, because Iran is not just the enemy of Israel. They're also trying to hurt and dominate many other Sunni Muslim nations in the region. Hamas gets support from Iran, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad gets support from Iran, and Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization that's currently ruling Lebanon, unfortunately, is an Iranian proxy. Those are actually the three largest terrorist threats that Israel has, and all of them are part of this Iranian network. In the 2000s, the Iranian threat received a whole new edge with two major developments. Number one is the development of the Iranian nuclear program, basically that Iran wants to achieve nuclear weapon. Now, knowing the malicious intent that Iran has for Israel, nobody wants to allow, for good reasons, no decent person should allow even the distant possibility of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And the second was the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was started at the end of 2010 and resulted in the collapse of many states in the Middle East, which kind of opened the door for Iran to control different states. Today, Iran has unbelievable influence, proxies, militias, troops that are stationed in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. This is how dangerous the Iranian threat is to the stability of the region, the United States security, because Iran doesn't only hate Israel, they also hate America, which they call the Great Satan. So I hope I gave a quick summary for the history of Israel with terrorism and the Iranian sponsorship to terrorism against Israel.
That was very, very eloquently spoken. So thank you so much, Hussein. We are going to have a little Q&A session, and we have 1 or 2 questions. So the first one is, what are the causes of anti-Semitism in the West, both from the far right and the far left?
Wow, that's a very big question. There are a lot of debates about anti-Semitism. To give a short answer, first of all, I think it's a fundamental issue to understand political issues and understand historical issues. So I advise everybody to actually care about anti-Semitism and try to learn more about its history. But anti-Semitism is a pre-modern phenomenon. That is, it's not something new. It's been around for a very long time now. There are questions. Different scholars would place it in different periods of time, but there's very little doubt that it didn't come with us since antiquity. That means that already in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, let's say in Alexandria, in Hellenic times, we saw the historical records of anti-Semitic targeting of Jews. Now, the problem as well, you have to understand that Jews are quite central to the history of religion, of Abrahamic religions, both Christianity and Islam. Those are the 2 biggest religions in the world, but not just the 2 biggest religions. Those are the 2 biggest civilizational paradigms. The Western civilization, and before that, the what we can term Islamic various civilizations. All of those religions have a direct tie to Judaism. They trace their lineage to the Jewish God, the Old Testament, to Jewish prophets, to Jewish ideas, Jewish characters, and Jesus Christ himself was Jewish. So there is no way to talk about the world without talking about Jews. Let me put it this way, especially if you're a Christian and you know this, right? There is no way for you to talk about the story of God, that's, the biblical story, without mentioning the Jewish people. And that places the Jewish people at a central place, whether in our religious experience, which is quite profound because it has to do with the nature of reality, the big questions, right? Who you are, what are you doing here? But also the history of civilization itself, whether Western civilization, as I said, or Islamic civilization. Jews are central players here. So unfortunately, that makes anti-Semitism that is directly tied to animosity and irrational hatred towards the Jews an accompanying phenomenon, something that we'll always see. Before racial anti-Semitism also transforms. It takes whatever the shape of the spirits of the days, whatever is happening today, anti-Semitism will find its place. For example, when in Christian Europe in medieval times, when everybody was Catholic, Jews were, the killers of, God killers. They are the people who killed Christ. They are the murderers of God, and so on and so forth. And then even after the Enlightenment, with the rise of the secular, enlightened, atheistic European consciousness, when things become racial, then Jews became an inferior race. When things become nationalistic, then Jews became foreigner intruders that we have to cleanse the pure body of the nation from. So whatever is, it's a weird phenomenon, but whatever is happening, you'll find always Jews being assuming the contrast of your ideal, whatever that ideal is. So if your ideal is diversity and social justice and equity and equality and so on, Israel, which is now today's representative of the Jewish people, will assume the role of the nationalistic, oppressive, white, colonialist settler. But all of this is just the decorum that anti-Semitism is assuming today. But as I said, it's a very ancient phenomenon. There is no conclusive. There are a lot of different theories about why and what does it mean. There are psychological and psychoanalytic theories. There are sociological theories about the origins of anti-Semitism. But it's an interesting question.
And it kind of leads right into the second one of what double standards do people use against Israel? And it's related to the first question. If you would like to address that one as well.
No, people use every possible double standard against Israel. Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. When Israel, I remember, for example, in this last war, the terrorist organization Hamas, I want you to think about this. They fired 4,000 rockets indiscriminately. Israel is a small country. If you've ever been to Israel, it's a tiny country. They fired 4,000 rockets randomly at Israelis, and thankfully Israel has a technology to stop most of them, and which Israel did. Israel ended up performing a limited number of airstrikes in order to eliminate the terrorist threats. Of course, some houses were demolished. Unfortunately, not a lot, over I think 250 people got killed. And people were complaining why this is a very disproportionate response. Israel is responding very disproportionately. Like 16 Israelis got killed, and then they killed 200. I wonder if what proportionate response would have supposed to mean. You know, would that have been 4,000 indiscriminate rockets fired from Israel at the Palestinians? And here you see, whenever you hear those things, you see the amount of ludicrous hypocrisy that a lot of people are applying against Israel, whether in terms of self-defense, whether even just questioning Israel's right to exist as a nation, questioning the legitimacy of a Jewish return in the homeland. So pretty much anything about Israel, people apply double standards to.
Well, thank you so much. And if anyone else has any questions, you can put them in the chat. So feel free to use the chat to write any additional questions you may have. Thank you so much, Hussein, for speaking, and we just really appreciate you taking the time, and it was really great to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So now we will have our second speaker, Nathan Altschuler. He was with us yesterday and he's with us again. He has a lot of amazing perspective and stories. And so I'll introduce him again. Nathan is the Senior Mid-Atlantic High School Coordinator at Stand With Us. Nathan served as a paratrooper in the 890th Brigade in the Israeli Defense Forces. Nathan is an experienced guide and coordinator for Olim L'Tavor and worked for the Ministry of Defense in Israeli security sector. He holds a bachelor's in communications and political marketing from the IDC Herzliya, where he completed the Argyle Fellows Program in leadership and diplomacy. So Nathan, welcome. And also today, the topics are going to be about anti-Semitism, as well as experiences as a Russian immigrant, and some experiences in the Army. So Nathan, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura and Naomi, and it's always an honor and a pleasure to share the platform with my good friend Hussein. So I'll start from my background just to explain a little bit where I come from, and then within the background I'll talk about my perspective about speaking to different communities and the way that I use my background to hold a conversation against anti-Semitism. My parents, Alexander and Rosanna, were born in Moscow, in the former Soviet Union. I won't say the dates because they get upset when I mention their age. This was when communism controlled this part of the world. So their birthplace was a country which, number one, denied them the right to practice their religion. Number two, took charge of their identities. And number three, it refused to allow them to speak of their ancestral homeland, Israel. Now, my parents specifically chose to fight back against this government repression and anti-Semitism. as many Russian Jews did through clandestine meetings. This is where they first met, where Jewish identity and the state of Israel was discussed. And as you can imagine, anti-Semitism was rampant back then, as it is unfortunately now. And my parents made the tough decision. They said, you know what, we don't want to stay in such an atmosphere. So long and shortly after they got married, they immigrated to the United States, where I and my 8 siblings were born. So yes, they have 9 children. They're raising them with a strong Jewish identity and a respect and understanding for the state of Israel. Now, as I said yesterday, these 2 individuals, my mom and my dad, they taught me that sometimes supporting a very significant cause in your life, no matter what it is not an easy or safe undertaking, but it's an important thing to do. So I was raised by parents who literally had experienced anti-Semitism their entire childhoods. So I was always taught to, number one, speak up for myself, to be proud of myself and my background, to educate myself about my background and about the communities that we live in. And again, to always speak up. So I grew up hearing stories of their experiences, how they came to the United States, what propelled them to come to the United States, why they chose to raise their children in a place where they could practice their religion safely and proudly. I grew up hearing about heroes like Natan Sharansky, who we heard about yesterday, and I think Hussein mentioned the 3Ds as well, which he created to identify anti-Semitism while he was in the Gulag. Upon graduating high school, it was no surprise to my parents or to me that I decided to go to Israel to complete a gap year. So the ability to be in Israel, where my childhood history lessons not only came to life in front of me daily, it reminded me of all the lessons and stories that I heard of my entire childhood. So I felt an obligation to serve. And now it's very important to note that this was my individual feeling. Not everyone feels this way. It was my obligation to stay and to serve in the IDF. This is what I wanted to do. I was the first person in my father's family who had made it to Israel. He and my ancestors had only been able to dream about it. He only made it to Israel way after he moved to the United States. And my grandfather and my grandmother still have not been there. So I served as a paratrooper in the IDF in the 890th Brigade. And then after I served, I ended up rejoining for specific personal reasons to serve in the Ministry of Defense Social Branch. What I did in the Ministry of Defense Social Branch was prepare other lone soldiers. What's a lone soldier? A lone soldier is either someone who comes from abroad and chooses to volunteer, whether it's through Machal, volunteering, or Aliyah, which is becoming an Israeli citizen, or someone who's estranged from their family in Israel. And I would work to prepare them to serve in the IDF, to prepare them to go to better units, to learn Hebrew, to understand the field, navigation, etc. Now, those years of service defined me, they changed me, and they reignited my motivation. And during those years, my Israel story, which technically this is my Israel story, was not just a story anymore. I was living it every day. And when I came back to the States, it was obvious to me that I would want to continue this service. And Stand With Us gives me this opportunity where I can educate and empower the next generation, which will jump into kind of a little bit of what I spoke about yesterday, but I want to reiterate those terms. The things that we teach our students, the things that we teach our high school, middle school, campus students, and community members is all based around the fact really about education. Education is the most important thing. And of course, as you can imagine with Russian immigrant parents, education is the #1 thing in my home. So #1, educate yourself, educate your family, have those conversations, have those nuanced discussion, understand the sources of hatred, understand the different forms of hatred. Tell your story, be proud. Just like the story that I just told you, this is something that I will tell someone if I bump into them at Wegmans. I'm proud of it and I own my story. I know how to explain it. I know how to say it. I know how to highlight the most important parts. What motivated me? What motivated my parents? What do I do today? And if you see or hear something anti-Semitic, take action. Whether it's sharing a post on Facebook, whether it's sharing a post on Instagram, whether it's engaging someone saying, hey, let's grab a cup of coffee, let's have a conversation. Try educating them calmly about why their words are offensive. Engage the appropriate authorities when necessary. And last but not least, as I said yesterday, again, build relationships and bridges with people who are not Jewish, who are within your community, not in your community, welcome the stranger, attend cultural events, understand the community that you live in. Another thing that I want to focus on is the experiences that I have had through my life have definitely propelled me to speak to different communities. And one of the things that I recommend to everyone is we all have special aspects of our identity. I'm very proud of my Russian Jewish identity. I speak Russian. So one of the things I do with Stand With Us is I have a program specifically for other children of Russian immigrants, where we speak exactly about what I spoke about today, Natan Sharansky, the 3Ds, the understanding of anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union, Russian Jewish heritage in the former Soviet Union, then in the state of Israel, and here today. What can the Russian Jewish community do? I also speak Hebrew, so I work with students of Israelis who live within the United States as well, where again, I focus on how do we empower the student with their Israeli identity so they can have those conversations when they get to campus, so they can have those conversations in high school. And another important thing that, again, it all goes back to really understanding the big picture. And one of the things with the students that I work with, specifically in high school, is understanding the new world that we live in, which is the internet age. And it sounds crazy for me to say that this is new. Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, we're seeing forms of anti-Semitism. Back in the day when I was in high school, if someone wanted to say something rude to me, they'd have to meet me in the locker room or meet me after school while we're waiting for our parents or the bus. Now it's a post on Instagram. So we have to move forward with the times and work very hard to educate our students so that they can engage using those platforms, which is what they use anyways, that we can educate them how to understand misinformation, how to fact check things that they see online, how to have nuanced discussion with their friends, how to have discussions with people who message them or people who they message. This is extremely, extremely important. And those 3Ds, demonization, double standards, and delegitimization, fall under the category of things that we're seeing on social media. I'll explain a little bit about what I do for work, and then I'll open up for questions because I'm not really sure about the time limit today. What I do for work is I run the high school internship in my region, which is the Mid-Atlantic, the Teen Leadership Council, and general outreach. What we do with high school interns is a holistic approach to education. What does that mean? We try very hard to balance the complicated details with the overall big picture. We focus on what? Understanding the facts and the different perspectives about Israel and beyond, and acknowledging that everyone does what? Everyone brings different experiences, different values, different levels of knowledge to the conversation. Our approach integrates things that I'm learning about this semester, even social emotional learning, relationship-centered learning, student-centered active learning. And I work really hard to add experiential teaching to it. We encourage the students who we work with to be responsible for their own education as well, to really grapple with the issues, to empower their peers, and to educate themselves as much as possible, and to have those nuanced discussions. The team lead, and this is a one-year-long program where the students really are superstars, and they meet with us twice a month. They have continued education seminars. They have those tough discussions. They have those nuanced discussions, and we really prepare them so that when they get to campus, they are ready to hold those conversations. The leadership councils for students who want a 4-month semester-based program. They plan innovative Israel programs. This is an opportunity to further their knowledge in a semester-based program. I don't want to use the word quick because we really try hard. I don't like teaching quickly, but it's a quick program. It's 4 months. They engage in this program. They have individual and group learning about Israel, about anti-Semitism. They have mentorship from their coordinator, who in this case is myself, in leadership skills, community building, and they have access to the incredible Stand With Us speakers and materials. And of course, what I think is the most important, and I'm going to reiterate it a couple times, to connect with other teens in the region with similar goals and aspirations. And that is one of the most important things we can do for our students, to give them a group of friends, give them a group of peers with similar goals, with similar aspirations, so that when they get to campus, when they become young professionals, when they become CEOs, executives, doctors, lawyers, doesn't make a difference. They have that person to contact when they have to have these conversations. I hope that was clear. I know I talk very fast. I am open to any questions that you have about my work, about my background, about the Army, about my parents, and about Stand With Us in general.
As usual, that was incredible. Yes, so I would like to open it up to questions. If anyone has questions for Nathan, he has all the answers.
Not all the answers. Definitely not all the answers.
Okay. So yeah, if anyone has questions about some of the programs that he's organized, some of his work with Stand With Us, as well as his involvement with the youth, like different groups here in the DC area, now is the time to ask, so feel free to ask. we'll give people a second to think a little bit.
We got plenty of time, don't worry.
So if anyone has a question, you can write it in the chat. But I can start off with a question. Oh, one person says she learned a lot. So that's good.
Thank you.
Yes.
From Hussein. Hussein, by the way, sharing a platform with Hussein is the highlight of my week. And I know he's still there. I know he can hear me.
That's exciting. Yeah, that's very nice. I heard Hussein speak a few weeks ago as well, and it's just really impressive. Let's see. Oh, that's very nice. In terms of any advice you have for navigating and attending all of those cultural events, what's your big takeaway as you engage with the community?
Number one, I think that a lot of people think that it's difficult to find these events. It's not. Every community has local synagogues, churches, leaders, lay leaders that are more than willing, trust me when I say more than willing, to send their events over to you. And one of the biggest things that I learned, and I think I touched a little bit on this yesterday, there is no end to education. No matter how educated we think we are, you still need to read more, have more conversations, and attend more events like this. I think one of the things I pointed out last semester was, last session, even some, I read a lot about this topic. I talk about this topic all the time. And sometimes when I speak to people, I learn that, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. I have to read that book. Send me that autobiography. Send me that article. Keep learning, and don't be afraid to go talk to a community that you're not a part of. That's also important. A lot of us specifically, let's focus on my parents. Russian Jewish immigrants tend to move to communities where there are a ton of other Russian Jewish immigrants. Why? Because they're more comfortable. Does that mean that my parents shouldn't talk to people who grew up in the United States or get out of their comfort zone? No, they definitely should, and they have. And it's extremely important. We have a rich history coming from Europe, which is something that our neighbors ask us about. And they have a rich history growing up here. That is something we should ask about. So I think it's extremely important. Mostly if you go to a public school or even a Jewish day school, there's so many different denominations within Judaism. Ask a question. There's nothing wrong with asking a question, or nothing wrong with admitting I don't know. So let's grab a coffee and have a conversation. Teach me about it. Okay. I also see a question from Amy. How should Jews respond to the school's teaching that everything should be looked at through the lens? Oh boy, that's a tough question. Lens and minority Jews are considered the white person. So in my line of work, I'll be very straightforward. I don't really deal with this specific thing. What I do is empower students to fight anti-Semitism and learn about Israel. So when it comes to stuff like this, we're a nonpartisan organization. So I don't really deal with stuff like this at all. My students, the biggest thing that I dealt with, I'm trying to think that last year, right now, Stand With Us just published a letter to the board of the Fairfax board of the school district. You can look it up on our website. Let me see if I can pull it up. That is something that we definitely do when there's anti-Semitism, blatant anti-Semitism coming from someone who's sitting on a school board or someone who's involved with the school system. We have a legal team that will take automatic action and write a letter, research it, understand it, and talk to the board or talk to the school about it so that our students can feel safe within the community. I'm going to try to pull up the letter and put a link in the chat now so you guys could read it. Let me see.
While you're looking for the link, another question came in that I wanted to ask. What do you say to people who say that the Palestinians are also Semites? So how can their supporters be anti-Semitic? And either Nathan or Hussein can answer this one.
Perfect. Okay, got the link.
I can.
Go ahead, Hussein. I missed the question while I was posting.
All right, I'll take this question before I leave. Well, the term anti-Semitism, I mean, we come up with words and we're stuck with them no matter how poorly formed they are. So yeah, Arabs are also Semites. But the term anti-Semitism, as it was first coined, I think in the late 18th century Europe, it was specifically coined in a European context when the word explicitly and exclusively meant animosity towards the Jewish people. And the word continued with us since then. I personally don't like the word because it is first of all, it comes from an anti-Semitic legacy, and it doesn't quite represent what this is, which is Jew hatred. But that's what the word anti-Semitism means. It doesn't mean hatred to people who are of Semitic origins, and hatred towards Jews can be from anybody, from Arabs, from non-Arabs, from Europeans, and from so on. So yes, it's true. Arabs are also Semitic people, but that's not what the word anti-Semitic means. The word, if you open a dictionary, the word exclusively means hatred towards Jews.
Naomi, did that resonate?
Yes, I think so. Thank you, Hussein.
Thank you so much, Hussein.
Thank you, Hussein. And Laura and Naomi, you'll see the letter that I posted. For those that got the link, I highly recommend reading the whole thing. It's going to really give you an outline of how we deal when there's blatant anti-Semitism within a school board district. And you'll see I copy and paste the first aspect of it, which is one, the recent statements made by an FCSB board member, two, how the statements are divisive, harmful, and marginalizing impact on Jewish students and teachers in the district. And number three, how the school board's lack of concrete action in response to this well-publicized matter affects the Jewish students in the community. And within the letter, we highlighted a bunch of different incidents as well that have happened in the past. So I highly recommend reading the whole thing because it really will highlight how we do deal with blatant anti-Semitism when it comes from a school board district in a high school.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So now, and everyone, please take note of that information in the chat. Now we will transition to Naomi. She will share some information on some legislation that is occurring. So go ahead, Naomi.
All right, thank you, Laura. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, so I'm going to discuss a couple bills that will help strengthen the US-Israel relationship, which will also in turn strengthen the Middle East, promote stability there. The first one is House Resolution 261. The Palestinian International Terrorism Support Prevention Act of 2021, sponsored by Brian Mast, although it has 55 co-sponsors from across the aisle. So this is very much solid bipartisan legislation that everyone should support. It was introduced several months ago and referred to two committees, Foreign Affairs and Financial Services. So this bill does a few things. Number one, it sanctions Hamas, which, as we spoke about earlier, is the terrorist group that governs the Gaza Strip. And they planned the war that happened against Israel in May. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad is also sanctioned by this bill and any other affiliate groups. So it would require the president to report to Congress on a list of foreigners that support these targeted groups. And it requires the president to report on foreign governments that continue to provide support. So this bill would ensure that our taxpayer dollars are at least not supporting terrorism, ideally supporting actually helpful things when the US sends aid to the Gaza Strip or truly to anywhere in the Middle East. So you can ask your representative to support House Resolution 261. A couple reasons you can give are that weakening Hamas and its affiliates will contribute to the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as Hamas is a State Department recognized foreign terrorist organization. The EU and several countries also recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. And as I said before, the bill helps ensure that our taxpayer money isn't supporting terror. On the Senate side, we have the Israel Relations Normalization Act of 2021. This is sponsored by Senator Rob Portman from Ohio. It has even more, it has 57 co-sponsors with a lot of notable names, including Cory Booker and Ben Cardin. So on June 24th, it passed out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so definitely going in the right direction, and it is on the Senate legislative calendar. So here's hoping it gets introduced soon. This bill requires the State Department to strengthen the Abraham Accords, which is the peace treaty that was signed by Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE last fall. It also requires the US government to outline a strategy to promote further normalization. And it requires the State Department to report on a couple things. First, laws, particularly in Arab countries, that punish individuals for people-to-people relations with Israelis. So perfect example, Hussein reached out to Israelis in friendship when he was a teenager in Egypt. And because of the anti-Semitism that's so deeply ingrained in Arab culture, he was actually imprisoned and even tortured just for trying to reach out in friendship. So this would also protect the human rights of Arabs. It doesn't just help with the goal of normalization with Israel. The State Department would also be required to report on evidence of steps taken by Arab governments to permitting or hopefully even encouraging normalized relations between citizens and Israeli citizens. I also wanted to bring up Kinda El Khatib in relation to the bill I just mentioned. She is a 23-year-old who is imprisoned in Lebanon, and her crime was collaborating with Israel. She has also committed the crime of showing enthusiasm for peace. She's spoken out against Hezbollah, which is another terrorist organization largely backed by Iran that's taken over Lebanon. So if we pass a law like this would help people like her, and hopefully it could allow more of Kinda and her colleagues to come forward to reach out in friendship to Israelis, just one person at a time, without having to fear for their human rights. That is it. I also wanted to let everyone know about the rally against anti-Semitism that's happening this Sunday in Washington, D.C. I will share my screen again. So this is the poster. Since I downloaded this, I think several more organizations actually have signed on. So it's being sponsored by dozens of mainstream Jewish organizations and non-Jewish organizations as well. The meeting point is at the west entrance of the Capitol this Sunday, 1 p.m. Show up, bring your friends. There is also free busing. So if you don't live in DC and need a bus, go to nofearrally.org. And with that, I will turn it back over to Laura.
Well, thank you to everyone, to Hussein, to Nathan, to Naomi, and also to Emmett, to Endowment for Middle East Truth, for collaborating on this speaker panel or this webinar event, Israel and Anti-Semitism for Curious Non-Jews. And so here we are on a Wednesday afternoon, concluding this event, but let this not be the conclusion of your continuous education, learning, engaging with different communities, and standing for Israel and taking action against anti-Semitism. And come out to the event on Sunday, 1 p.m. in Washington, D.C. So hope to see you all there. Thank you all so much.